do you guys think would have won a national championship in 2018 had the CFP been 12 teams instead of the original 4? Welcome back to the channel, guys. In this video, we're going to be going over a hypothetical scenario where the CFP had the 12 teams back in the 2018 season versus the 4 teams. So, we're going to start off with what the original 4 teams were. Obviously, Alabama was number 1, Clemson at number 2, Alabama was number 1 and SEC champion. Clemson at number 2 was the ACC champion. Notre Dame obviously was independent. They did not win a conference. And Oklahoma was the Big 12 champion at the number 4 slot. As well as Georgia, runner-up in the SEC at number 5. And Ohio State, the Big 10 champion, number 6, missing out the playoffs. And also we had Washington at number 9, was the Pac-12 champion. Those are your 5 Power 5 champions. Only 3 of them made the CFP champion playoffs. So, if the playoffs was expanded to 12 teams, well, how would it be? We're going to go over it right now. Let's see how it would play out with the 6 automatic conference champions and the 6 at-large getting into this playoff. We'll start out with number 1 overall seed. Undefeated Alabama was 13-0. They beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. They had that memorable comeback with Jalen Hurts coming in off the bench, so subbing for Tua. They got the 13-0. No surprise there. They're one of the few undefeated conference Power 5 champions. Number 2, obviously, was Clemson. They won the ACC. They beat up on Virginia in the conference championship game. Had a non-conference victory over Texas A&M, which turned out to be a really good win. And then they had a couple wins over Syracuse. Just absolute domination on their part going through the ACC. I think they won every single game by an average of 33 points. So that was absolute destruction. Clemson had a weaker strength of schedule than most of the other teams, but they proved to had one of the better resumes. Points per game, margin per game was tops of the nation, and they deserved to be number 2 slot. Number 3, Notre Dame did not play in a conference, obviously, but their schedule was warranted. They had a good enough resume. They beat Michigan, who was finished as a top 10 team. They beat Syracuse, they beat Stanford, and they beat Michigan State. So they had 4 good quality wins on their resume, as well as going undefeated. They had a couple close games there, but it didn't matter because they won them. So the resume-wise, Notre Dame was clearly one of the 4 best teams in the nation to get in the original 4-team playoff, and they get in the top 4 to get a first-round bye in this hypothetical 4-team playoff. And finally, the last Power 5 champion would be would be Oklahoma. And obviously, most people's debate was between a 12-1 Oklahoma squad and whatever it be in this one, Ohio State as a 5 seed. Now, you look at everything, every single metric you can play look at with these teams, they're almost identical. Resume, Oklahoma had 3 wins. They got a win over Texas. They had a win over a decent TCU, and they had a win over a top 15 West Virginia squad and a decent Iowa State. Ohio State had a good win over Michigan, obviously. They had a good win over Penn State, and they had a decent win over TCU. Their offenses were top-notch. Oklahoma had the number 1 offense, I think, of all time, yards per play. Ohio State was a top 5 offense. They were just killing people. But the only metric that you could really look at that would be obviously the outlier, it would separate these two from a 4 to 5, was their 1 loss. Oklahoma lost to Texas, their rival, at a neutral site by 3 points, a last-second field goal in a high-scoring game, whereas Ohio State's loss was to a 6-6 Purdue team by 29 points, 4 touchdowns on the road in the middle of the season. That was just too much for the committee to not overlook, and that obviously was the tiebreaker. I mean, you look at any team that night, Purdue had a Tyler Trent night, God rest his soul. I don't think many teams, if any team, was beat Purdue that night, just the way they were playing and how hot they were. But it still didn't take away from the fact that Ohio State lost by 4 touchdowns to a team that would inevitably finish up 6-6. So that is why Oklahoma finished as the number 4 seed with a bye, and Ohio State still get a home playoff game, but they finished as a 5 seed and had to play in the first round. Number 6 goes to Georgia, the SEC runner-up. They only losses were to Alabama in the SEC championship game and to LSU, who lost by 20, I do believe, in the middle of the season, but still had good quality wins over Kentucky and Florida to get to the SEC championship game, win the SEC West. I think they beat Florida and Kentucky by at least 2 scores in each game, so they well deserve to get the 6th spot, and they're one of the better talent composite teams on paper and the eye test, so they should well deserve of a top 6 slot and get a home playoff game in the first round. Number 7 was Michigan, the team that Ohio State destroyed, and Notre Dame beat week 1 by 7. Michigan still had a good enough resume to get to this number 7 slot. They beat Wisconsin, they beat Penn State, both by a lot. And how bad the Ohio State loss was, they still finished at 10-2, and would get a home playoff game in the first round at the number 7 slot. Finally, the last team to get a home playoff spot would be the highest Group of 5 champion, UCF, 12-0. They had another undefeated season. The year before, they went 17-0, had or 14-0 in 2017. Had that miraculous win against Memphis in the conference championship game, and then they beat Auburn in the Peach Bowl. This year, they played enough, little tougher strength of schedule overall in conference, and that earned them not only a first round bye into the play, or a first round admission into the playoff, but a first round home matchup against the number 9 seed, which would be the inevitable Pac-12 champion, Washington, who finished at 10-3. They had 2 wins over Utah, who they beat once early in the season and in the Pac-12 championship game. They also beat, I do believe it was Oregon, to get to the conference championship game. So they had a couple losses, they also beat Washington State, who was one of the a top 10 team at the time. They beat them last week of the season in the Apple Cup to get to that Pac-12 championship game where they got to 10 wins. So they are the final conference champion to get into this. So that's where the top 9 stand. Number 10, who's Michigan playing in the first round, is 9-3 Florida. Now, they had wins over LSU and I believe Kentucky, but they also lost to Georgia by a lot. And the rest of their schedule, I think they played 2 FCS teams. So 7 of their 9 wins were against decent teams. 2 of them were FCS, but they did enough still in the committee's mind to get them that top 10 slot, and they will go to Ann Arbor in the first round in the 7-10 matchup. The number 11 team, Penn State, lost to Michigan, lost to Ohio State, and they lost to Michigan State the week after they lost to Michigan. So 3 losses to pretty decent teams, a couple of wins over Iowa, and one of the other, I forget who the other team was in the Big Ten, but still got the 9-3, one of the 12 best teams in this. I do believe they would get this right, putting Penn State at number 11. They would travel to Athens, Georgia to face the Bulldogs in the first round of the CFP playoff. And finally, the number 12 slot, basically a toss-up between LSU, Washington State, and Texas. Those are the 3 teams kind of vying for this last position. And ultimately, though, I think they would choose LSU. The committee would choose LSU as a final representative in this. Texas, they got to 9 wins. They had some good quality wins, but I don't think they would have chose a team that's not even a conference champ that had 4 losses to be in this, as well as Washington State got to 10-2. 10 wins is pretty remarkable for a Power 5 conference, but their strength of schedule was below 35, and they had decent wins over Stanford and Oregon, but that was about it. Their out of conference was very, very weak, and they just didn't do enough with their wins in their schedule with the Pac-12 to get qualified for this last 12-team playoff. So LSU did. They lost to Texas A&M. They beat Georgia. Had that top 5 matchup against Alabama. They got shut out, but they still did enough for their strength of schedule. Got good wins over Mississippi State as well. So they get LSU Tigers get the last spot in this 12-team playoff. So here we are, guys. Who would win the hypothetical 12-team playoff if the field was set like this? We're going to start in the first round and go through every round until we crown our national champion. So, hypothetically, UCF versus Washington. I do believe UCF would beat the Huskies. Washington was one of the weaker Power 5 conferences in the entire CFP era. They're 9-3, and I just don't see them being a contender over UCF, who had a really good squad, made it to the Fiesta Bowl in real life, lost to Joe Burrow in real life in the LSU, but I think this team would do enough to beat the Washington Huskies in the first round. They move on to the quarterfinals to face Alabama in the Peach Bowl. Move on to Ohio State versus the said LSU team. I think Ohio State, with their offense, Dwayne Haskins was just clicking down the stretch there. I think they would overpower LSU. Their defense was decent, but Ohio State offense, I feel like, was just way too much. They put up 62 against Michigan. Probably could have put up 70 if they really didn't step off the gas. And they put up 45 against Northwestern in that Big Ten championship game to get to 12-1. I think their offense would just be way too much for LSU, and they would move to 13-1 and go on to the Rose Bowl to face Oklahoma in the quarterfinals. Michigan versus Florida. I think no matter how good Michigan's resume was, they were just one of the biggest, I'd say, frauds as a 10-win team in the CFP era going into the last week of the season. Don Brown's defense was just absolutely feasted on the lower tier talent, but when it came to actual good opponents, teams that had, I guess, comparable talent, there's no way it would work. And Ohio State just picked them apart, play by play, drive after drive, and it just exposed Michigan as a overrated team that just had a really good defense against lesser foes, and their offense was just, middle of the road, and it obviously wasn't enough. And I think Florida, how kind of weak their schedule was, I think they still would have done enough on the road in Michigan in December to pull off this upset victory. I think in real life these two teams played, albeit Michigan had a lot of players out, but they still got dominated by Florida. I think the same happens in this hypothetical playoff. Florida moves on to face the number 2 seed Clemson in the quarterfinals in the Fiesta Bowl. And finally, Georgia hosting Penn State. Georgia was one of the teams I think ESPN, Kirk Herbstreit argued should have been in the 4-team playoff even after they lost to Alabama in that SEC championship game before they gave it to Oklahoma. And Penn State, they lost to the 3 best teams they played and didn't really have a good, huge, major quality win besides Iowa the rest of the season. I think Georgia would handily beat Penn State. I think this would be kind of a repeat of what Georgia did to, I do believe it. Oh wait, no, Georgia lost to Texas in the bowl game, but I think Georgia would handle Penn State, I think by at least a couple touchdowns, and they would move on to the quarterfinals to face Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl. Going back up to the top, starting the first matchup of the quarterfinals, Alabama against UCF in the Peach Bowl, 2 undefeated squads. I don't think this would be much of a matchup for Alabama. I think Tua and their receiving crew would just pick apart UCF. Their talent would be just well overmatched, and Alabama move on to the semifinals. I mean, there's not much to really say about this. I think UCF is a great story for the 2017 and 2018 seasons, but you put them up against Alabama, that team was just too dang good, especially on offense, and I think this would be at least 17, if not a 21-point plus blowout in the quarterfinals. And then Ohio State against Oklahoma in the Rose Bowl. I think the better offensive team would come out on top of this. How good Ohio State's offense was, I think Kyler Murray and this Oklahoma offense was just that much better against everybody. I think, again, I said before, they had an NCAA record for yards per play. They broke it. I think they averaged 9 yards per play. This is the greatest and the highest average in the history of NCAA football. 150 plus years, or this would be season 149. So 149 years of college football. Nobody has ever, before them and since them, averaged more yards per play for an entire 12-game plus season than the 2018 Oklahoma squad. I think they would beat Ohio State. Ohio State had too many just disasters on defense. They gave up 51 points to Maryland, second to last week of the season. Obviously, they gave up 49 to Purdue. They gave up a lot of points to TCU in that neutral site game. TCU finished, I think, with only 6 wins on the season. So I think this Oklahoma would Ohio State's defense just couldn't keep up, and Oklahoma would just outscore them. This would be like a 55 to 45, 55-48 kind of game. I think Oklahoma would come out on top and advance to the semifinals to face Alabama in the Orange Bowl. Clemson against Florida. I don't think this would be too much of a task for Clemson. Florida was a decent team, but Clemson, Trevor Lawrence, they were just dominating teams down the stretch. This is just going to be like the Alabama UCF game. I think Clemson would just annihilate Florida. I think this wouldn't even be close. This probably would be over by halftime. I think Trevor Lawrence would have at least three passing touchdowns, if not more, and Clemson would just, their defense would suffocate Florida. Felipe Franks and Clemson would move on to these semifinals of the Cotton Bowl, where they would face the winner of Georgia Notre Dame, and I think that would be Georgia. They would win their second game of this tournament. Notre Dame, resume-wise, like I said before, they had 4 good quality wins heading into this. There's no way you could argue that on paper this team, resume-wise, wasn't one of the 4 best teams in college football. But the eye test and this talent-wise, they played too many close games, and then in real life they played Clemson in that semifinal game. I think they lost 30-3. It should have been 50-3 the way the flow of the game was going. I think Clemson just kind of chilled after they're up 21 points. And I think Georgia would have way much more talent than Notre Dame, and I think they would just beat Notre Dame, move on to the semifinals to face Clemson in the Cotton Bowl. So, semifinal matchup, basically the same as in real life. Only difference would be Georgia instead of Notre Dame in the semifinal matchup. So, Alabama against Oklahoma, there's no shock there. I think Alabama would be a repeat of that Orange Bowl game in real life. I think Alabama would All it took was 1 to 2 stops on that Oklahoma offense, and that defense would just give up as many points as they possibly can, because how good their offense was, their defense was historically bad too. I think they're at least in the 70th range of like total yards and points per game. I mean, their offense obviously was number one, but all it took, like I said, if you get 2 stops on this Oklahoma offense and your offense is, above average, you're probably going to have a good chance to win. And Alabama is going to do that. Tua's going to light them up, put them up for 40 again, and I think Oklahoma would still score points towards the end there, but Alabama would move on to the national championship game. Clemson against Georgia. Again, I think how good Georgia was, this Clemson squad was just on a mission. They beat, I think it was 8 or 9 games they won by at least 40 points or 35 points, 5 touchdowns. Yes, it was against a weaker ACC team, but still, this Clemson team was ready to go. They were on a mission. They wanted to get revenge from 2017 loss to Alabama, and I think they would whomp on Georgia. I think they beat them by at least 2 scores. This defense, especially the defensive line with Wilkins, Farrell. I mean, they obviously had AJ Terrell at cornerback. Isaiah Simmons was only a freshman that year. This defense was loaded, and I think they destroyed Georgia. They beat them by at least 2 scores. They go on to face Alabama in the national championship game. So, a rematch in real life. Who do I think would win in this? Going through this gauntlet, the teams they had to face to get to this point, I think there would be absolutely no difference. I think Clemson would get to 16-0. They would beat Alabama. Not saying they would beat them 44-16 because Alabama had a lot of bad luck and bad play calls in that to make it, such a big margin. But at the same time, though, I'm not going to argue that Clemson would not still beat Alabama, even if Alabama kind of knew more of their plays and had a better better time to prepare. I still think this was an all-time Clemson team. In my opinion, was still better than in the 2019 LSU squad. But that's just me, looking too much into the metrics. But all good their offense was, I think they're number 4. Their defense is obviously number 1. They have one of the top turnover margins in the country. There's no way Clemson would not win this and win your 2018 hypothetical 12-team CFP national championship. What do you guys think of this video? If you liked it, hit the like button below, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell for all future videos. I'm going over, I went over, this is the 5th installment of this. I went from 2014 all the way up to 2018. Next step is the 2019 season, so we'll have to see what happens to that one. But until then, see you then, guys. Enjoy your day.